Hello everyone and welcome to another Premier Pundit podcast. Today I'm pleased to announce a fantastic guest for this special episode. We have Mark Gillet. He's Chief Medical Officer for the Premier League, a guy that we've conversed with on several occasions, but I'm seeing for the first time in flesh over Zoom today. Mark, brilliant to see you. Thanks for joining us. How are things? Pretty busy, I would imagine.
Yeah, busy time for us, Ben. Thanks for inviting me on. It's pre-season. There's always a busy time for doctors in the Premier League, whether you're working for a club or you're working for the league. So, there's a lot of very busy medical teams about at the moment.
Yeah, look, before I kick things off, I want to offer a heartfelt thanks from both myself and everybody that will be watching this video, who are all football fanatics, because you played a key role in bringing football back. You were one of the main, players in terms of Project Restart. So thanks for that from the bottom of my heart. I want to cast your mind back to, to March 2020 when, our world come crashing down, really. Yeah. How difficult was it time? I mean, we always talk about, this is unprecedented, and certainly during my lifetime it is. Yeah. But logistically, when we're talking about, when that decision was made to halt football, does the pressure then move from those stakeholders to say, right, well, actually, when do we move forward? When can football be back? What conversations were happening in and around that time, and what considerations did you have to make?
Well, I think unprecedented is a great word, because it was. I think we were entering, I think it's probably the only time in my lifetime in the UK where we've been living in real time in science and medicine. So, you probably know that most of the time we base what we do on evidence, which is accumulated over a period of time. And this time we didn't have the luxury of doing that. So there was a lot of unknowns about what was going to happen. There's a lot of unknowns about what would happen when and if young people got COVID. And there was understandably a lot of apprehension and a lot of fear, amongst players, everybody involved with the game. So it was a matter of breaking it down issue by issue, group by group, speaking widely, both predominantly to public health experts in the UK, public health experts internationally, leagues internationally. And just coming out with sensible steps, sensible progressions, and never losing the sight of our major job was to keep people safe. But I've got to say, I think the medical staff involved in football clubs were amazing during that period. So there was a lot of very personal stories on an individual basis, which were quite humbling, I think. And they all did an amazing job just managing their players, managing their clubs, and putting the measures in place, which enabled us to get back quicker than pretty much any other sport. So, I think as a football community, we need to be really proud of that collective effort.
Yeah. The Premier League was suspended in and around March. Were conversations already taking place prior to that about, because, the pandemic and the figures across the world were on the rise? Yeah. Were you already looking at ways to say, well, initially suspend the league and, we'll see what happens?
Well, it all happened very quickly. So from a situation of thinking we might, what is going to happen here, what's going to be the extent of how this is going to affect elite sport, we went from that pretty much from that stage to within 10 to 14 days to the first cases of COVID in Premier League football clubs. And then at that time, it became pretty clear what we had to do, and the league was suspended. So I think, the decision was made as quickly as it could have been. And although there was planning about how we'd manage that, it moved so fast that actually, the appropriate measures were quite obvious at that point.
And you talk about appropriate measures, and I almost think, and since the Euro final, and suddenly we talk about pressure, but I can imagine it as being the chief medical officer for the Premier League, and in terms of making those decisions to stop, suspend, and then ultimately bring football back, the book firmly lies with you. And I know you've been a big advocate of saying, you know, saving lives is a priority, sport isn't, but it's about finding that balance. I mean, in terms of yourself, your personal, you know, the role that you're doing, how was the pressure, you know, during that period from, you know, from the world, you know, from everybody who had a vested interest in Premier League football?
Yeah, it was tough. I mean, I was lucky that you know, I was working with Richard Garlick at the time, who's since moved to Arsenal, and you know, he was did an incredible job leading the Premier League through that period, and coordinating all the efforts to write the protocols and engage with the club. So, you know, I think the Premier League staff certainly did themselves proud during that period in the way that they pulled together. And you know, at times it did look like it wasn't going to be possible. And I think, you know, constantly rebounding from setbacks, uncertainties, adverse publicity, people weren't supportive initially. You know, it was difficult. So yeah, it was a high pressure time, but you know, that's why you do the job, isn't it? It's no different to anybody else. You wanna challenge yourself and make a good contribution, and I think I'd like to think that we all did that.
Yeah, and I will go, you know, return back to the Premier League, but you know, working so hard as you did over a number of months to bring football back, and I'm presuming here that you may have, or you'll certainly be aware of the incidents that happened in and around Wembley Stadium for Sunday's, you know, Euro Championship final. I mean, how much of a concern and how disheartening is it to see, you know, what happened in terms of those crowds and you know, everything that went on that was associated with that game, and does that then, you know, I suppose have a knock-on effect for your thoughts and decisions maybe going forward for the Premier League?
Yeah, it does. You know, I think it was upsetting for everybody involved in football, the scenes that we saw on Sunday. So I think, you know, we're mindful of that. I think, you know, the thing we've learned about COVID is it's a very fast moving scenario. So generally the information goes on a 2 or 3 week turnaround. And now I think it's getting even quicker where information is turning around on a weekly basis. So, you know, we've got 4 or 5 weeks before we get underway. Freedom Day on Monday. You know, I think we know that there's going to be an increase in COVID transmission in younger people. So that needs to be managed both in terms of the players and in terms of full stadia, which is something we hope we'll see at the start of the season. So again, we're relying on people obeying the rules, employing common sense, and doing the right thing. And I think if we can do that, then, you know, we'll get the season underway as planned, and we can hopefully slowly move back to normality. So, you know, I think it's an important time for all of us if we want to resume football as we all like seeing it played.
Yeah, and I'm glad you touched upon Freedom Day, because nothing really is going to change overnight. In other, you know, business sectors, what we've seen are businesses, you know, accepting that you know, there are no restrictions in place, but yet they're going to implement their own. Do you think that's something that the clubs will look to maybe, you know, really sort of take the bull by the horns and make those decisions to help protect, you know, those people in attendance at the matches and keep maybe some restrictions in place?
I think, you know, again, you know what, Ben, I'm not being evasive at all. I think, you know, this is going to be staged very carefully over the next month. Freedom Day next week. We'll see what happens as people start going back into hospitality areas and, you know, utilising, you know, indoor areas as they have done previously. Now, if when we get to August and September, there's a big spike in COVID transmission, and ultimately there's a big increase in hospital admissions and the dependency of patients in hospital, then, you know, I think we'll be led by the government about what we do next. So I think at least now we've got some experience of, you know, how things work with COVID, where we can react quickly and put the measures in place to keep everybody safe, because ultimately we all love football, but you know, people's lives are more important, and we need to safeguard those.
Yeah, And finally, on COVID, in terms of managing the players, I know it currently, it went from 2 tests in a week to 1 test per week for players. Is that something that you'll just look to continue? I mean, would the increasing detection rates of these new variants, the Delta, the Lambda, will those, influence maybe changes in the protocol as we go forward?
So in the Premier League, all players will be tested twice a week, starting the season with lateral flow tests. And then if they test positive on a lateral flow test, then they have to have that substantiated with the PCR. So, and in order to gain access for a game, they'll have to have that registered on the clinical passport. So, we're running a very, very similar program to that which we ran last season. The only difference is that we'll be doing it with lateral flows rather than PCRs, which is quicker for the players. And actually, lateral flows now are very good, so they're pretty reliable. So the initial work we've done with them, we've been very, very pleased with how accurate they've been.
Brilliant. Well, I'm going to leave COVID for now. I want to, I want to move quickly on to the Euros. And there's a couple of sort of key incidents there, which I hope will be of particular interest to yourself, because back in 2019, you wrote a journal article on defining the process of cardiovascular risk assessment program and lessons learned from assessments in elite soccer. And of course, the world witnessed, that the tragic events that unfolded in Copenhagen with Christian Eriksen. Fortunately, it looks as if, Christian certainly for now is going to be fine, although the long term, we're not so sure at this moment. But watching that incident, seeing that incident, is that, how that player reacted and the response, did that, take you back to 2019 and why you wrote that initial sort of article? And, what was the premise of that, just for those sort of watching the video?
I think I've been involved in pre-hospital care in sport for a long time. So years and years ago, I was a consultant in emergency medicine, so that's what my background's in. And when I got into sport, I was very interested in that. And I think again, we should be justifiably proud of the way pitchside doctors and physios are trained, and the way that equipment is mandated pretty much in world football, because ultimately that's what saves people's lives. So and I think when we talk about cardiac screening, which again is very, very important, so it reduces the risk of something happening on the football pitch, but it's a screening process, so it doesn't totally eliminate it. So in order to keep people safe, you have to have that combination of the screening people and making sure you've got appropriately trained people with the right equipment, so that you can preserve what we call the chain of survival, which is early defibrillation, early CPR, and early transfer to hospital. And that's exactly what happened with Mwamba. It's exactly what happened with Eriksen. And I think, we should be really, really positive about how far we've come with that over the last 10 to 15 years. So it's a really big positive for football, I think.
Yeah, and as a parent myself with 2 young children, and a lot of people will be watching this video thinking, who are actively engaged in sports and who have children, and watching those scenes unfold, it's a worry, because you're thinking, right, as your average person on the street, we don't have access to screening.
No.
We can't.
No.
I mean, is it irrational to have those fears, and just how rare are these instances? And are you able to put maybe people watching this video that minds at ease, as if to say
I mean, it is incredibly rare, so it's very, very uncommon. But I think and certainly the Premier League is doing some work at the moment with grassroots football on this. The key thing is to have defibrillators at many public access places as possible. So there's no doubt that if there's one thing that we could do to keep people safe, it would be to have defibrillators every grassroots training and match facility in England. I think, that is, that would be money well spent, and just making sure that people know how to use them, because it does require a minimum of training. They're very straightforward to use. And really it's early defibrillation which saves people's lives, and we should be doing everything to facilitate that. But bottom line is it's an incredibly rare event, and it certainly shouldn't stop you from playing football and enjoying activity.
Yeah, thank you, Mark. Much appreciated. Now, another incident in the Euros, and I mention this one because, again, you've been a very vocal when talking about prioritising players' health, particularly when it comes to concussion and head injuries, and the FA, directive, if in doubt, sit them out. And that was an incident involving France defender Benjamin Pavard. Now, against Germany, television, and it's coverage, and obviously we're not privy to what's happening on the pitch, but it clearly looks as if Benjamin Pavard was caught and went down. There was no outstretched arms to break that fall. It looked as if he was out cold. Player comes out post match and says, I was out for 10 to 15 seconds, and then ultimately he's allowed to continue to play 90 minutes. And then secondly, involved in training, trains up to the next game and plays in the next match. I mean, this is not the first time this has happened, on the world's biggest stage. This has happened in the World Cup in 2018. Are we doing enough to protect players from head injuries and managing concussion?
I think, to use the words of politicians, it was disappointing to watch that. Look, if a player's knocked out from any contact of head on the football field, he needs to be withdrawn from the pitch immediately and follow a return to play, which is commensurate with the level that he plays at. So that's 7 days if you're an elite professional footballer, if you're in an enhanced setting, and it's longer for recreational players. So, I mean, it's very difficult to justify if somebody's been knocked out and the medical staff know that he's been knocked out, that A, he's been allowed to stay on the pitch, and B, he hasn't followed a formal return to training protocol. I would cover that by saying we never know exactly what's been said, between the player and the doctor, what access to technology they had. And there may be some extenuating circumstances, but visually it's a very bad precedent. And certainly, had that been in the Premier League, I'd have been very, very disappointed.
Yeah, and in terms of, you go back to the Premier League, because in every instance that's happened under UEFA, and I read the guidelines, and the guidelines, you must put in writing when a player's going to return to play. They will be assessed independently, so on and so forth. And yet, when these players do, we never see any kind of retribution. There's not a deterrent. I mean, are those, I suppose, deterrents or those guidelines or that protocol in place in the Premier League to stop that? Are players now, are discussions taking place to take the emphasis away from the club, have an independent medical officer at stadiums to make that decision away from the actual clubs?
So one thing we will be doing in the Premier League this year, and I think it's going to be key, is sort of formalising and improving our use of video technology. So in the Premier League this year, each medical team will have a tablet on the bench. They'll all be trained how to use the Hawkeye system and replay incidents. So they'll be able to have the same views that pundits have, which I think is important, and they'll be able to do that in real time. And we've also, made it very clear the signs that you'd expect on video, which would lead to a player being withdrawn from play. So, I think we do need to continually improve the way we do things. I'm certainly pretty happy with the way we're doing that at the moment. And I'm hopeful that Premier League doctors will find that very useful and guide even better care of concussed players in the Premier League. So we now have head injury subs as well. So your concussion subs up to 2 players per game, increasing use of video technology. All players are followed up as part of the IFAB trial if they come up with a concussion substitute. So I think we are starting to get the data that we need. And I think over the next 2 to 3 seasons, we'll continue to acquire that data and really land at a place where we can be completely comfortable where we are, and we're running an excellent service, which is, going back to what we said at the beginning, keeping people safe.
Yeah, brilliant, Mark. And obviously, I know you're pressed for time, so I really appreciate it. I want to move quickly on before we pull this interview to a close. And you talk about continually improving and assessing the situation moving forward. Project Restart, in terms of this level of injury incidence and burden on clubs and availability, came out of that very, very well. All of the talk prior to the restart of the Bundesliga and the Premier League was we're going to have this glut of injuries. And actually, the injury that we collected at Premier Injuries showed that hugely successful in mitigating the risk. Injury incidence was actually down. And that was partly due to the fact that we had the 5 substitution rule in place at the time. We also have drinks break. Yeah. Now, unfortunately, there were clubs advocating to maintain those as during 2020 and 2021. But unfortunately, the number of votes weren't carried to allow that to go in place. And I understand that it was rejected actually 3 times. But now, off the back of a season on a shortened pre-season campaign, then straight into the Euros, then another domestic campaign and then you've got the World Cup, next year. Also, are the 5 substitution, rules? Is that back on the table in terms of, sitting down and negotiating with clubs?
I think, that's a question for Richard Masters in the Premier League execs. I think, look, I have absolute confidence in the Premier League clubs making the right decisions to look after their players. I think, they do a pretty good job at judging that. We obviously have to make sure that the league integrity is protected, and we don't affect the competitiveness of the Premier League. I work for, how can I describe them? So I work for a middle to lower half club for 10 years. And to win a Premier League game at that level, it takes so much effort. Everything has to go your way every particular week. And to put those clubs at a disadvantage with 5 subs, I think would be a tragedy. So I don't think it's an easy question to answer. I think it's very, very difficult. If we do have clear evidence that player health and their safety is impaired, then that's another issue. But I'm not sure we have that data yet. But having said that, the football calendar is getting increasingly busy. They're getting very little respite. I think that is a bit of a concern. So again, it's like all things in football, it moves forward. And I think, we will certainly keep it under review and see where we land over the coming season.
Yeah, I mean, certainly I'm aware that Chris Wilder was dead fast against it early doors, and also Steve Bruce had been reporting to be against it. But in those 2, I mentioned those 2 clubs in particular because they started quite well, but in the latter half of the season, both suffered significantly in terms of incidents and had, in excess of, they had double figures in terms of players sidelines in parts of the campaign. So, look, discussions to be had, but like you say, Mark, clubs are really excellent at managing the squad. Look, I just want to say thanks for joining us. It's been fantastic. Brilliant insight. Love the knowledge. I absolutely loved catching up with you, Mark. And I hope you did too, because like I say, we have a very knowledgeable audience. By the way, if anybody does have any questions, please pop them in the comments box below. We'll have more content like this, so feel free to press that subscribe button again, and you make sure you won't miss out when we release another video. But for now, Chief Medical Officer for the Premier League, it's Mark Gillet. Fantastic. Thank you once again, Mark, and hopefully we will speak to you again very, very soon.
Thanks, man. Thanks. Good to speak to you.